Yeah, I think if the most jarring was the cow farts, right? Um, I mean, I had no idea that eating meat had an impact on the environment, right? And I think you told me that probably about 6 months ago in one of our late night discussions or whatever. It wasn't I didn't believe you, but I'm like, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that kind of makes sense. But when you saw the data and when you saw that, um, I guess what do they call it? The agricultural segment, right? Which is primarily, the cows and the methane gas. Um, was double digit percentage of the overall emissions, all emission sources, right? I think it was right next to cars or automobiles, whatever, right? That segment.
Welcome to another episode of Animalia, where we bring wildlife conservation, climate change, and social justice together to help people connect the dots and get involved. So today on Animalia, we are actually taking a bit of a different step from talking to, experts in the field on specific matters and talking to my father, Jim Veraldi, about his sort of journey on the climate topic. For context, he born and raised in the 60s and 70s and, kind of grew up in a generation where this was not talked about often. He will talk about this in the episode, but he, politically leans more conservative, but is generally, more of a moderate than I think what we think of conservatives today, but certainly leans that direction and has been going through, some education of his own around climate change and some personal changes a lot in the last year or so. And we're gonna talk about that because I think it's very important because there's a lot of people out there in his camp and a lot of people in my camp that are trying to find more productive ways and, kind of mutually respectful and practical ways to talk about this with people like my father. So, Dad, thanks for joining. Let's start with just, why don't you sort of introduce yourself, a little bit about like where you come from and then what your core values are just as a person, what's important to you. I think that'll help kind of lay a foundation for the rest of the chat.
So, I mean, I was, I'll say always born in the Midwest, but in Michigan, as you know. And, from there I came east and landed in New Jersey working for Exxon Mobil. And then basically I've spent the rest of my life out east with a few years in a couple other places. And those kind of shaped the values. And again, us coming from I'll say a strong, tight-knit Italian family, classic male dominance back in that era or whatever, but, strong family values and, Italian Sunday dinners and grandma and things like that, big network of cousins and those kind of things. So those help shape your values as well as the, spiritual side, which they were, we were, Catholics, certainly, from going to church and going to Catholic schools and things like that. So that's kind of where my values, developed, or the foundations. And, if I look today and say, to me, it always comes back to integrity. And while that word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, I think that's why it's a good word. It means, honesty. It means trust. It means reliability, right? It means you're true to yourself, right? Those types of things. And I think that, I try to act with integrity in everything I do. I'm certainly fail frequently, but I really respect that in others, right? And I know, my children would say, yeah, that Dad always wanted us to be honest, right? I said, hey, if you do something stupid or bad or whatever, I can't help you for lying to me, right? So that honesty is important. I think another value that I learned kind of growing up was just work ethic, right? That, things take work. anything worth getting takes work. I mean, once in a while I get lucky, something lands in your lap, maybe things like that. But, I don't care whether it's a relationship, a financial, goal or whatever, right? It takes work and in some cases hard work. Um, so, having a good work ethic, I think I saw, certainly my father work hard, my mother work hard at the home, raising the kids, and people around us, right? And, I think coming from that kind of strong work ethic background of kind of Metro Detroit, growing up as a kid, was instilled in me as a very young age, right? I mean, I have been working since I was 14, not, like digging ditches, but still always had a part-time job and things like that, even though, it wasn't for, essential expenses, right? Our family was, fairly well off. Um, and then I think I've stressed the family that is extremely important, but I think it's some type of spiritual um, or faith foundation, right? So I'm feel like I'm fairly a strong Catholic. At least I try to be in my actions and certainly in my thoughts. And again, never perfect, but um, I respect people with a strong faith, right? And it doesn't have to be my faith, but just a strong faith. I think that's a solid foundation. At least it helps guide me that I know there is some kind of higher power. Mine might be different than yours, but I certainly personally believe there is one, right? So that's kind of the foundation and the core values, and a little bit like who I am, you know, besides just being Jay's dad.
In terms of your like political and social societal values, um, is it fair to say you lean more conservative, but would feel more generally more moderate? And then what are the just top one or two things for you that are important to you on a kind of societal, or political basis?
Yeah. So, that's an interesting question. And while the spectrum of liberal conservative always been there, it has certainly become very amplified and probably stretched in the last, I'll say at least 10, but maybe even longer, 20 years, right? Maybe it's been on, a journey. So,
It's also
I mean,
always kind of changing and evolving as
yeah,
well. Like
I mean, it is,
it's
right?
not what
Because
it was
there's
20
there's
years ago. Yeah.
cornerstone beliefs that kind of put you maybe on one side, right or left. And some of those cornerstones change from time to time, obviously, right? Um, you know, we're not talking about the right to vote anymore, but that certainly was a cornerstone, right, at that time. So I would still say I'm conservative, you know, and I struggle sometimes because I'm not as conservative as some of the groups or affiliations that I belong to. Um, but for me, like if it's a religious thing, that's between me and my maker, right? I'm still going to say, I'm a Catholic, but I may not be as far, um, on the spectrum of that conservatism as some Catholics would portray to be. And then, in the same token, I think it's interesting because I think, um, given the broad exposure of media that we have access to now, and if you take it in, with a very small valve, right? Because I think there is some good information out there. I mean, you do become exposed to, um, the underprivileged, the underserved, whether it's, right in our country or around the world. Um, and you can't help but feel for that, right? Some may say that's a liberal point of view, but that to me is just a human point of view, right? And that's where, on those types of issues, right? Like I think, you said, what's your social issues? Yes, I think, uh, the tensions we have today are well rooted because they've been around for a long, long time, right? It's we've made tremendous progress if you look over the last, let's say, 50, 60, 70 years, but it's not that it's not fast enough, but we shouldn't have to be doing it, is kind of where we're at today, right? I still think it's going to take time, right? Some of it's generational, but for me, yes, I firmly believe that everybody should be treated equal regardless of skin color, race, creed, sexual orientation, whatever it might be, right? Um, so that puts me a little more on the liberal side than some of my conservative peers. So yeah, it's tough for me, right, to say I'm one way or the other, but I think in a lot of the cornerstones for me, I'm still probably more conservative than liberal.
Switching gears to starting to talk climate a little bit. There's two, I think, macro questions or spectrums, if you will, that people fall into on this. And I'm going to ask you like where you fall on each spectrum as of today, and then we'll kind of go back and see how that might have evolved for you. But so the first spectrum is the degree to which humans are responsible for changes to the climate. I would say responsible beyond, what we need to get by. Not responsible just in terms of just living, but how much quote unquote damage we are causing in our modern system. So that's one spectrum that people fall differently on, because there's some people who say, we are very responsible for the increasing climate conditions. And some people who think climate is just changing naturally always, whether we are here or not, we would be in the same position. And then the second spectrum I want you to answer where you're on is how urgent, you think the need to address it is. So again, there's some people who feel a tremendous sense of urgency. Obviously I fall in that camp. That the damages are like the problems are going to increase, continue to increase in the short term, and potentially reach a point of no return in the long term. And there's some people who feel there is no urgency, that the potential negative outcomes are so far out and so speculative, that it just doesn't feel like a priority. So where do you fall on the spectrum of kind of the human contributions to the climate issues, and then the sense of urgency on those issues?
Yeah, so not that it's puzzling, but the first spectrum, I would say yes, humans are responsible, right? There may be natural changes as well, but certainly I'm not any kind of astronomer or physicist or whatever. But because we are inhabiting this planet, we have changed the ecosystem, and those changes. If I even if you said, hey, there's some good changes we make, and there's some poor changes or bad changes we make, certainly the changes, the bad far outweigh any good we have done, right? With respect to climate change, and then ultimately obviously the negative and possibly tragic effects. So on that spectrum, I would say, yeah, humans are responsible, right? If not for 100%, a percentage that's probably greater than 75 in my mind. Not having read the research or anything like that, right? On the other one, right? So that centers around the sense of urgency, right? And for me personally, yes, in the last, just year or two, I felt a greater sense of urgency due to some education. But I'm not going to kid you. I don't feel that sense of urgency on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, right? I'm not getting up thinking about climate change, right? Which I think those with a true sense of urgency, like yourself, are probably doing. I'm not saying it's obsession, but it's you've incorporated into a lifestyle, and I think I've made changes, and I'm more conscious and aware and things like that. But I think there has to be some urgency to the dialogue, because the solutions are not easy to implement, and the solutions will take a very long time as well, right? Because some of them are behavioral changes and things like that take time, and then probably the overarching issue is that it's global in nature, right? I mean, yeah, you'd like to start with the superpower, so to speak, or the very large countries or large contributors, but um, you have to get some global collaboration on that. So those couple issues alone, as someone who would say, let's how do we plan for this? Since those issues alone are going to take a very long time, I think there's urgency to discuss, right? I don't think there's an urgency to mandate, certain things yet. Okay. And I think we should continue what we're doing, whether it's auto emissions and factories and things like that. I think we still need to continue those types of, regulations. But I think there's a lot more discussion, collaboration, and education that has to be done, at the same time. So, um, on the spectrum, needing to make immediate changes, I'm probably moderate, right? And I would say needing to keep education, awareness, messaging, that kind of stuff. I think there's more of an urgency to be doing, more of that for sure.
So now let's kind of go back in time to your upbringing and the generation you were raised in. As you mentioned earlier, you grew up in Detroit, son of two Italian parents. They were first generation or second generation?
They were second.
Second
So
generation.
their parents came
Yeah,
over.
correct. And I think for me, grandpa, for you, dad, but grandpa was a extremely hardworking person who grew up in a blue collar environment, a blue collar city, and made a lot of himself from those kind of
Right.
humble beginnings through Ford. I'm curious, like if we have talked about this a little bit. There seems like there was no real back then mention of anything environmental. Nobody talked about it. It wasn't ever hitting news cycles. There wasn't, what is that like? Was there any? Can you remember any that ever being a topic, whether it be in school, at the family dinner table, with friends, or is this something that just people were just not talking about when you grew up?
Yeah. I mean, well, I might have been young. I mean, you have to remember what time frame you're talking about, right? So, yes, I was around 60s, 70s, and 80s, but parents were around in the 40s and 50s, post-war, winning the war, and just utter prosperity, right? I mean, just America was just a land of riches, right? And we had everything, and we just proved by winning the war and things like that. So, that idea that you know in general, America was happy. People were working. There was a lot of blue collar, jobs, white collar jobs, and even a place like Detroit, was a hub, right? It was, it's not like what it is today, but it attracted a lot of people, right? And there was big, shows and the auto industry and things like that. So it was a cool place to be if you were an engineer or designer or whatever back in those days. But um, with that, there wasn't a lot of thought of climate change at all, right? I mean, um, I hate to say it, but even like, people would litter a lot more than they do today, right? The people would just throw stuff out their car, right? I mean, it was nothing to, if you change the oil at home just to hose it down the driveway or throw it down the sewer, right? I mean, that was not unheard of, right? Because the notion that there was so much of this stuff, it didn't matter, right? Um, and plus, you got to keep in mind where the media was at too, right? The media was primarily entertainment, right? I mean, color TVs were just coming out, right? Yeah, there was news and stuff, but it wasn't, educational, the kind of things we get today. So, you know, um, I mean, like recycling just started, and it was more about, hey, get a nickel to bring the bottles of, soda or pop back to the store. But there was no, you burned cardboard. Um, in our house, my father had an incinerator in the basement where you could just put stuff in and burn, and it would just go up, the chimney of the house where the fireplace and the normal furnace was. So bonfires were very common. Um, I think the first I got an inkling that something was going on was um, when the government imposed emission standard on the automakers. So, my dad, your grandfather was what they call an executive engineer, worked on the powertrain. So he was very much involved in when they had to make their cars more fuel efficient and emit less carbon, right? Um, there was one summer where he worked like 110 days straight, literally always going to the office. Saturday, Sunday didn't matter, because if they didn't meet certain goals, there was huge fines involved, right? So that's where we started to learn something was going on, right? Gas was whatever, 25 cents a gallon. Cars got 5 to 10 miles per gallon, didn't matter, right? There was no catalytic converters, and all of a sudden, right, something's going on that might not be good. So that would probably have been my first, inkling when I was young of that there might be, how people interact with the environment, right? Otherwise, I don't think many people made a connection at all back then.
And then you started your career at Exxon,
right?
Of course, one of the biggest oil companies in the world, still is today. Do you remember back then when you were there? Because that was what, early
80s, early mid 80s.
So what years? What years were you at Exxon exactly?
81 to 86.
81, 86. Yeah. Then he had the stint in France too.
Right. That was with Exxon as well. Right. For a year.
Yep. And what, were there any talks, do you remember, internally at Exxon about, the global warming that can come out of the burning of fossil fuels, the carbon emissions, and long term, right now it doesn't seem maybe incredibly problematic, but what happens 25, 50, 100 years from now if we keep going at this rate and we don't invest in alternative energies? Like, was that ever talked about internally at Exxon, or is it just not? It's just
So you got to get the time frame right. It's the early to mid 80s. I worked at the research and engineering group where those things should have been talked about. But again, I'm a kid out of college, right? I'm probably not at that table anywhere near it at that point, if they were talked about. But, a general feeling, if you say what was the buzz in the office or what was the culture or whatever, that we were going to run out of oil and we had to find new places to get it, right? That was Exxon's thing, right? Because this is coming off the 70s, Middle Eastern oil embargoes. People in the States waited, 4 or 5 hours to fill up a tank of gas, right? You know what I mean? So we grew up not thinking of oil as a fossil fuel, but oil as kind of a source of power, right? Oh my God, the Middle East could just crunch us because if we don't have oil, we can't survive.
And this was also, correct me if I'm wrong, this is before, even modern technologies like fracking existed to get natural gas. It was before deep water oil wells. I believe back then, most of the ocean wells were shallow water.
Yes, exactly. Because it was cheaper to get, and that was what we would try to forecast, like how the price per barrel, how fast is that going up? Because to get oil either distant ocean or like what I spent 6 months working on was the Colorado Shale project. How do we get oil from shale? The problem there, it was so remote and you had to build roads and towns and basically a city, right, to recover this stuff for the years. And it didn't make sense unless oil was X dollars a barrel. So that's where Exxon was, right? Saying, hey, we got to make sure that we can supply, the world with oil. And that's where they were, right? Because Exxon, they make all their money finding the oil, right? Everything else is round off. And there was no talk. I don't remember talk of global warming probably for 10, 15 years after I left Exxon. Take me to the 2000s or something.
Yeah, which segues into my next question was, you mentioned the first time you even had a sniff that something was going on was, in the emissions caps conversations at the motor companies and
right.
Your father, kind of being in the office long hours. I'm curious when looking back, when's the first time you kind of remember climate issues, climate change, global warming, I think, probably started more on the ozone discussion before moving into, greenhouse gases and global warming. But when do you remember that sort of becoming more widespread discussed? I believe it was the 88 presidential election was kind of the first time that it was even in the debates.
Right.
And that was very ozone centric. Is that around the time you remember, kind of?
No, I think you're right. That ozone conversation, I think, got everybody to kind of cock their head a bit and go, huh, what? Right. And, I would say a lot of people, probably including me, dove into it 20%. What are they talking about? What's this? Oh, okay, I got it. Oh, yeah, it's really far away, right? And some people dug in a little deeper, and then there's that huge chunk that just ignores everything, right? But that I think got people to say, okay, there's something going on with the interaction, right? But for me, that was still like news and something I didn't grasp on. I mean, if I just had to say, hey, I'm busy raising kids, and it sounds like a weak excuse, but there was a lot of activity, in my life personally. So I didn't even have the time to, even delve into the issue from a reading standpoint, or in a lot of cases, even have discussions about them. But I think for me, if I fast forward 10 years from then, when I got uh, remarried, that would be 98, and we took a cruise up to the outside of Alaska, right? And you see the beautiful, icebergs and things like that. Um, that's where I'll say the 1% or less. Hey, if the temperature increases just 1%, I understood the magnitude of the change at that point, right? I mean, this giant iceberg just being 1% smaller, or whatever 1% degree change would be, 10% smaller, and how much water that would be, and how much land, right, would be covered by that very, very small incremental change, because it's vast, right? When you look at something like that. So that for me was kind of the first time it hit me, late 90s. And I think some of the other stuff is honestly even, some of the movies that I've seen, right? Where companies are just polluting, the waterways, the earth, whatever that, what was it, Aaron Brockovich or whatever, right? That kind of hit me hard. I mean, people were dying because of this, right? Forget about just even harming the planet, right? So, I think we've made some strides there. Hopefully we have, but there's still a tremendous way to go.
The climate discussions have really accelerated, in the last decade. Even before, this 2020, which we'll get to, where it's kind of batting us over the head. And it's hard now. It's hard for me to fathom anybody could ignore it at this point. But even prior to this year, they started accelerating in the last decade, and prior to some of the changes, which we'll get to, you started making in the last year or so, and we'll talk as well about the kind of class we took together this summer. When you started hearing about, what were your viewpoints on, kind of environmentalists? Did you think of them as sort of, Woodstock hippie kind of tree lover type folks, kind of fringe movement of a community that, hey, good for them, but this is not really important to me?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say without a doubt, right? In a lot of cases, right? I mean, they were people I couldn't relate to, right? Either by lifestyle or by area of the country they lived in, kind of thing, right? Knew of them but didn't know any of them, kind of syndrome, and you tend to stereotype, yep, they're trying to save the forest, they're trying to save the trees. Meanwhile, I'm busting my ass trying to buy a house made out of wood, kind of idea, right? And so it's interesting. I think that section of people, like now I look in hindsight, I highly respect because they were ahead of the curve with what they were trying to do, right? But I think a lot of the stuff that, I'll say, well, I was too busy or it wasn't affecting me, right? Kind of the not in my backyard syndrome, um, also came into play in a lot of those things, right? So, you know, um, I think a lot of us, and I do certainly at times, just say, well, it's not affecting me or my day to day life, then, I don't have to deal with it, so to speak. Right. And I think as I've become less busy schedule wise than when you're, raising, four kids or whatever, um, right, I think you have time to become more pensive, right? And start thinking about these things more.
Even for me, if I'm being honest with myself, I think 15 years ago, it was for me. It wasn't even just that I wasn't paying attention to it. I would actually sort of, in jest, but crack jokes at vegans or Prius drivers. And again, not out of like a malicious intent, but just because I thought at the time that it was sort of unnecessary and kind of self-righteous, these people, and the preachy climate person. Do you share some of that? Like, were you in that joke cracking sort of sphere as well?
Yes, no question about it, right? I mean, that's just because I think anytime there's a new wave or movement or school of thought, those people are thought of as weird, right? The majority has to say there's something wrong with them. So we start cracking jokes on them because they're uncomfortable. Yes, I would say the same thing, right? Oh, the Prius driver, of course, what kind of person drives a Prius, right? Or whatever it might be. And that's unfortunate, but I think, you're an example that obviously your journey led a lot of different ways. And you look back and you're like, hey, what was I thinking back then? And were those people just, you know, further ahead of us saying, hey, I'm driving this kind of car because I'm trying to do my part, to reduce our carbon footprint, right?
Yeah, and I think some people do it for different reasons. Humans are tribal by nature. So some people just like, hey, that was a community that accepted them, and they kind of sort of live in it because we all need our tribes. For me, it was frankly just misinformation or lack of information. It wasn't something that there was. I didn't in my middle school, high school, college. There were no environmental like programs
Right.
or classes, as you mentioned. From it wasn't something that you and my mother really talked about at all.
We
And
took it to a
so
landfill. I know that.
that could be to a landfill.
Yeah.
Okay. I know that, that,
That was supposed to kickstart you.
okay. That's like, Trump bragging again and again that he blocked the flights from China. It's like, yeah, you did one thing good. But there are successive things you're supposed to do. But so yeah, sure. Thanks for the landfill visit. It didn't amount to much.
But going back more serious is that, for you 10, well, I'll say 8, 10, 12, 15 years ago, you had other priorities too, right? Right or wrong, but you did, right? You want to have, want to do this, I want to do this, whether it was business, whether it was career, whether it was, whatever it might be, right?
Sure, but if I'm being honest, it's not just priority, right? Because it wasn't that, oh, I have all this information and I know how important this is, but I'm still choosing to prioritize other things.
I get it, right? I mean, but I'm saying there wasn't even a lot of time to seek and listen or even be exposed to some of this, right? Because no, we all get on treadmills, right? Especially in, I'll say from 25 to sometimes 60, right? But certainly for some amount of time, you're on a treadmill, whether it's work, family, combos, whatever. Um,
Sure. What I'll disagree with you there is, like, we're kind of on a treadmill always.
yes,
And me, it's like, for me, my nature of someone who always wants to build things and do things, I'm going to be on a treadmill until the day I'm dead. It doesn't matter how much financial success I have or don't have. It doesn't matter. Like, my nature is I'm in a hamster wheel forever.
Yeah,
So
no,
like,
and
so it's not that back then for me, and again, I can only talk about myself, but for me, I don't look back then and say, hey, because I was so busy trying to get my career started, things like that, that's why, because I am just as busy now with work, if not more so actually, than I was back then. But now, I'm making space for this work because I realize how important it is. And I did not have that realization information back then. So for me personally, and again, just I can only speak for myself, it wasn't a matter of prioritization or being busy or, because I had to get my career going. It was because I am busier now. It was just a lack of information and a sort of, yeah. And yeah, I mean, it just lack of awareness.
right. But we're saying the same thing at a different angle, right? I mean, you know, you're never going to be not busy because you're my son, right? I mean, that's how you're programmed, right? But in the same token, somehow, some way, you were found the time or made the time to get exposed to understand. And the more you started to understand about climate change, the more you got into it. And then you did give it more space, right? Whether it's in your choice of foods or spending more time shopping or more time preparing, any of the many things you do that, others would say are inconvenient, right? Or take more time, right? So in one way, shape, or form, right? That's what we're trying to get to with a lot of people, but it's how do we get into that? It's not just a pivot because it's just not a one time thing, but you're a very good example of that, right? I'm not saying you ignored it totally, but now you're at a point where busy as ever, but yet you're going to make sure you make time for it.
Yeah, and again, what I'm challenging and generally is the kind of prioritization, or I'm too busy to worry about climate, kind of just general rationale, because we all can make time for things that are important to us, and
Exactly. That's
like I think of yourself, right? Like you even at the height of your busiest times, whether it was starting MicroStrategies, having Robbie,
right.
you still did a lot of work with impoverished children. You've done a lot of work with local animal shelters. Those are things that are important to you.
Right.
So like even at your busiest times, you've made time to still do that work. You've done a lot of work in your local community in Denville. Like that was just
Yeah.
important. So I think whenever I hear, hey, I wasn't paying attention. I was just too busy. Later in life, I get this sometimes from people. Hey, I will get to a place in life where I can start to, make changes in my life and care about the environment. And I will always now challenge that because I think it's not a matter of can you find the time. It's just a matter of, do you feel this is important enough to make the time? And by not making the time, then you're effectively saying, no, I don't think this is important enough to make the time. More so than, yeah, I think this is important, but I don't have the time.
Yes. So that's usually the pushback, right? You would get from certainly someone like me, and I think a lot of others, because it sounds, because we're not that informed, I'm a little bit more informed now, but it sounds really hard and very time consuming, right? But what I've at least learned and been exposed to in short order is that, you can do small things that don't require a lot of time or don't require even much change in your routine, right? And you slowly develop a new routine, whether it's, hey, I'm going to, you know, try to buy local, right? For vegetables and fruit, produce, whatever, right? So it sometimes you look at the people who are at the forefront, or I look at you even and say, wow, Jay has done a lot of things, right? He's not only made tremendous changes in his life, which I don't know if I have the time to make all those changes, right? But he also finds time to, you know, further the cause through, education, whether it's local, whether it's one-on-one, whether it's one-to-many, right? Boy, that's great, but I'm not, and it just sounds way too hard for me. So I'm just going to say I don't have the time for that right now, right?
And we're going to get to in just a minute the kind of communication challenge
Yes.
of climate, what I think you're kind of teetering around.
I think it's also the chunking challenge, because I think we got to get little bite-sized chunks for people to start to make small changes too. You know what I mean? But we can talk more about
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And also that those small changes matter when I think a lot of people sometimes think, well, if you're not doing something major, what's the point? And so we'll talk about that. But just as a precursor to that, I just want to touch on the class that you and I took this summer. It was something I asked you to take. We tried to get Robbie to take it as well. Did not succeed on that front. But although to Robbie's credit,
I don't think anybody would have taken it with the two of us, but go ahead.
Sure, but I was like, well, I guess I should tell people Robbie is my half brother and your son.
Yes.
But to his credit, he actually is very environmental forward, and really does care about these things. He's also grown up in a generation where that is much more prevalent and popular. But anyway, put that aside for a moment. I asked you to take the class because I wanted to indoctrinate you in this world more in the way I've been for several years now. And it seemed like the class had a strong impact on you. I know you're someone who is very analytical and data driven, and actually seeing hard data was important versus kind of hand wavy stuff for you.
Yes.
And I want to ask, like, what first part of the question is, what do you remember of, like, what were the specific data points that stood out to you, or what was, was there one or two things that you look back on in that class we took? And for context, again, for listeners, it was a Coursera class from the University of Michigan. I very, very selectively chose the University of Michigan because I knew you needed to trust the information.
Yes.
And that is a school that you got a degree from. And so, what stood out to you? What do you remember that was like, wow, like that's jarring. And that now I'm like rethinking this a little bit. And so that's the first part of the question is what stood out to you from that class. And the second part can you share some of those maybe smaller changes you started to make in your day-to-day life, or even your day-to-day thinking or your day-to-day communication with people since finishing that class?
And that just blew me away, right? Because I had no idea. I mean, if you'd have asked me prior to the course, the source of emission, I would have said, yeah, cars and factories. That's it, right? Very shallow kind of answer, right? So I don't remember the data specifically. I remember that many of the statistics were so jarring, right? That even from an engineer or an analytical standpoint, I'm like, even if they're off by a factor of 2, right? The numbers are still alarming, right? Because we can all poke holes in scientific evidence and proof and theories and everything else. But so that kind of definitely got me to pause. And the other information, I think I thought I knew some of it, but I think a lot of it was the rate of acceleration was more alarming, right? So it might have taken me from centuries to decades, and I'm not using those as the exact terms, but that kind of change. What it did for me is it kind of reinforced some things. I'll say we, Carol Ann and I, we're casually doing. Yes, we recycled. Yes, we did this, but being more conscious, and then more conscious of you're doing a job of recycling, but it's the stuff up front you got to worry about, right? Like, why do you have to buy the thing with all the packaging, or can't you buy vegetables this way or that way, right? All of a sudden, I began to look at packaging differently, right?
Correct. 'Cause recycling is far from a perfect process. For folks listening, a lot of things you send to your municipal recycling plant don't get recycled in full, and it also takes energy, right, to recycle and run those machines. So yeah.
Right. So if you could eliminate the plastic bottle altogether, you don't have to recycle the plastic bottle, right? That's the whole idea. So those types of things, right? It woke me up to seeing how not reliant, but we choose a lot of paper products even in our house, right? And I'm like, you know what? I know using a dish or a cup, you got to wash it and stuff, but it's better for the environment if you wash it properly. Don't leave the water running, things like that. So I think there's small changes there. And yeah, while I haven't gone out and replaced the cars, I definitely think I could have made a different choice. We probably bought 2 cars in the last 12 or 18 months, but we usually buy them every few years. So I think there'll be different choices there. I mean, yeah, these are more fuel efficient, but it's way more than what I need for one person driving 90% of the time or whatever in one car, that kind of thing. It just, again, makes you think differently, right? And I think it also lets me look at some purchases and companies, right? I don't want to say every single purchase. I'm trying to find if the company is doing the right thing environmentally, but I'll keep my eyes open. I do read, the Wall Street Journal. I wish I'd say every day, but that's my newspaper, and I just like the business world, and those kind of things are interesting when companies are doing or not doing what I consider more of the right thing now with respect to, the environment and climate change.
I guess then that's a good segue into the next question, which, I made a point to try to avoid as much as possible in this recording to talk about politics in the election.
You've only done it twice so far, but go ahead. I'm not keeping track or anything.
Yeah, you're not keeping track. Twice in an hour is not bad. Come on. Given we're as of now we're recording it, we're 3 days from it. It's a little bit top of mind.
We're going to end with a bang here.
Yep. So, without the need to share who you're voting for, I'll leave that up to you. But just how is the climate issue? How has it factored in at all to your decision? Maybe not your decision on presidential, but on other officials. Even on local elections, things like that. Has it started to become a factor for you? Is it not there yet for you?
It's. I'm thinking about it a lot more, right? Let me give you one quick example, then I'll come back to the meat of your question, right? So I'm now living outside of Charleston, as you know, South Carolina. My vote is still a New Jersey absentee ballot. So I'm not voting down here, but obviously I can't help but hear, commercials, media, the news, signs, whatever, about the local politics. And one issue that has come up quite a bit is offshore drilling, right? And it's interesting that most of them are just worried about the cosmetics. They don't want the offshore drilling in the horizon. Right, that's what they're worried about, and I think like they're missing the point of the issue here. But I've paid much more attention to that issue here locally, even though I'm not voting down here, because I think I'm more sensitive to those things now. Now, on the grander scale, whether it's president or local officials and things like that, again, I'm listening more now. And sometimes just listening for omission, right? Because I think many people, politicians, people running, don't talk about it because it's not a hot issue, right? And I think we got so many issues that are so hot today, right? That it's not there. I think if this would have been, what I think we can all agree on would have been a normal election. I don't care what side you're on, kind of a normal election that we've had at least since I've been around. I think these kinds of issues would have got a lot more airtime, right? But I think given the situation, given the players, given everything that's been going on here, nobody has really even brought the issue up in any great detail, right?
You're talking about locally on the presidential election?
On the presidential side,
it's certainly
right.
You don't think either candidate has brought it up?
Well, it hasn't. They've brought it up, but I mean, and we certainly know where the candidates stand on it, right? At least from a ideological standpoint.
Ideologically, we know details about where Biden stands on it. We have no details on Trump's plans. He hasn't put anything forward as his nature generally. Biden has at least put a plan together. Now, you can critique it, but at least he's put something forward on like, hey.
I don't want to get into politicking, right? Whether it's better to put a plan together and then not implement it, or it's better to keep your mouth shut, right? Because that's politicking, right? You're asking me, where's the issue been for me, right? And it hasn't been that high in this election, only because there are so many other burning issues right now, right? That I think I have to listen.
Do you see that changing, I guess, even though it's not very high for you right now, would you say it's at least more top of mind than in the 2016 election? And then, it's always hard forecasting the future of the crystal ball, but do you think, in 2024, it may be even more top of mind? Do you think you're moving that direction?
Moving in that direction, yes. But I'd also think that, and I want to think that it's like either it's not a binary, either I'm thinking about it or I'm not. But I might look at global diplomacy, right? Which candidate, which party, which representative, whatever, which governor, right? Maybe not governor, but would have a better time of being a better diplomat globally. And I may want that for a number of reasons, but one of them for sure is because we've got a climate change issue that unless you have, global alliances, don't have to be your friends, but at least alliances, right? We're going to have a hard time solving this stuff. So while it may not be a climate change issue, it could be one of my other top issues that certainly climate change becomes what would you call it? A dependent thing of that issue, right? So if I want climate change, you need diplomacy, and diplomacy is important for me because I think being diplomatic is very, very important, especially at a presidential level, or having good foreign relations.
And which candidate do you feel does a better job with that?
I don't know yet, right? I don't know how Biden would do, but we could say Trump's done a poor job, but at the same token, I don't like being walked on either, right? So there's a fine line here, right? But
sure, I get that. I get to a degree, like sometimes you need to stand up for your own, but right. I think we can probably both agree that no one would describe the behavior and manner of conduct of Donald Trump as diplomatic.
See, now we're getting away from climate change, right?
I know, but you brought us here, so
yes. If there are scary scenarios on the other side where if Sleepy Joe isn't with us very long, I don't think the next in line is very diplomatic.
Yeah, but Joe certainly has shown his age and will continue to. I don't think he's going to kick the bucket in the next 4 years. Getting back to climate, how do you think we make climate change less political and more bipartisan? Because it is troubling that it has been pushed, in kind of like, for those that are not very informed about it on either side of the political fence, which is a majority of people now, because a majority of people primarily consume headlines, right? They don't read a lot of things. That is an increasing problem in society. And so what's been happening, I see, is that majority of people, climate change is seen as a liberal issue, and kind of ignoring it, so to speak, is seen as a conservative, pillar. And that is very troubling to me because it shouldn't be political. It shouldn't be so politicized. Like how we address it might differ, but the idea of it existing and being a problem should be apolitical, should be bipartisan, but it's not right now. And the media probably has a lot to do with this blame. But putting blame aside, how do you think we address it? How do you think we make climate change a bipartisan issue?
Yeah, and you're spot on, right? I mean, somehow, and I must have blanked, but climate change became political, right? And it shouldn't be. There are many things in my mind that really aren't political, right? But they become political, right? You could say, I mean, I know I agree with many people, conservative and liberal, on immigration, on the end game for immigration, but how to get there, that's where people disagree, right? So with climate change, I think it's even more so that if you sit down and have a reasonable discussion, right? And like even in the course I took with you from Coursera, right? It's just basically presenting some facts and presenting, some videos and things like that. And you start to realize, okay, we should have, this kind of engagement, right, around it. But it ends up becoming, much more of a liberal issue, right, than a conservative issue. And I think if you get both parties to sit down, they would both end up probably coming closer to the center, because I don't think a lot of us disagree on some of this stuff. I still goes back to whether you want to call it a priority or how much we should spend on it, right? Again, if you had $10 and to solve all the political problems today, how much would you spend on climate change, right? People might say, oh, I got healthcare, I got, other education, I got housing, I got other more important issues to work on right now. Now, how do we do that? I think is the crust of the question. I think it's got to be the it sounds kind of funny, but maybe the Smokey Bear approach, right? um and I think most of your listeners are probably too young, but it was a big TV media ad about only you can prevent forest fires. And this was back in the days where people were just camping and small areas of forest were burning down, not like we have today, but it was just because they were careless with their fires or cigarettes or whatever it might be. But it became a huge campaign that people remembered, right? And I think that's what we need to do. There's got to be messaging on small things that we can do, right? And some of it may have to be legislated, right? I mean, whether you talk about paper bags, plastic bags, no bags, things like that, right? But I think there has to be a lot of small chunks, as we talked about a while ago, that we can push forward without having to get this grandiose agreement, bipartisan, on what's the best approach to solving the very complex problem of climate change.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It's something we have to just continue to chip away at, and we have to sort of move climate back into the middle, so to speak, on the political spectrum.
And I think to your point earlier, if it gets into the education system, like you said, I wasn't educated on anything environmental. You had very little exposure, from at least your schooling, right? But I think they are going to be doing more and more of that, or we should be doing more of that, just on a regular basis through all the education systems.
Yeah, unfortunately, that gets politicized as well. Right. New Jersey, you may be familiar with this, passed a bill requiring some basic environmental classes be put into public schools. I think it was K through 12. I forget exactly the grade level, but a number of kind of local Republican officials just spoke up against it, saying there's just other priorities in education. We shouldn't be worried about this right now. And so again, it just becomes politicized when it's like, hey, why not just educate the youth? Like, why is this even an argument?
No, but I mean, and yes, education, you're right, does become political. What should kids be taught, right?
Correct.
But yeah, we have to find ways, right? I mean, at least today, there's so many more media outlets than just the classroom, fortunately, unfortunately, but there are other ways to reach the youth, because I think a lot of it is still the youth, right? Um, who will kind of be the bearers of this for many, many decades. Not that everybody, including me, who
they're inheriting the problem, but I will say the decisions we make if you just look at the science
right,
and the climate reports, the decisions we make in the next 10 years are going to probably be way more important than decisions we make
yeah,
10 years after that. And for the next 10 years, it's not the youth that are going to be running governments and corporations. And so like there is, there is a need to, to get people from your generation down to mine who
right,
that's the sort of body that is in power and will be in power for the next 10 years.
right,
Way more on board and way more up to date on what's going on.
yeah. And that's not an easy nut to crack, right? I mean, like you say, you want to educate people between the ages of 30 and 60 or 30 and 70, whatever, right?
Well, that's kind of the next and last question I have here is, there's millions of Americans, that are in, kind of your shoes, right? In the shoes that,
Right,
in a sense of, just hardworking, honest, family oriented, value oriented people that are busy. American is a busy society,
hmm,
that are, deep down good people, but, have not really prioritized this at all, whether they're in like powerful positions or not. Some are not,
right.
but in both cases, they're not prioritizing this. They're not as informed. What would you say, like even to yourself, let's put it in a different way. If you could talk to yourself 5 years ago, yourself today, what would you tell that person and others like you?
So if I could talk to myself 5 years ago in 2015, knowing what I know today, you're saying?
Yeah.
Um, I think I would have made, just off the top of my head, different automobile purchase decisions, right? I mean, I hate to say it, but it would have been an easy one,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Um, it's interesting. I think, even like the small, I think, heating, fueling, air conditioning the house, all that kind of consumption in the house. I've been a fairly good, consumer of that from an insulation and things like that, conservation there, because it's economics to me, right? But so probably not a lot of changes there. Certainly, um, I still get flabbergasted by the amount of emissions caused by food, right? The processing and the making of the food, right? It just astounds me, right? So I think that's something that I would have had my former self spend a lot more time thinking about, um, to get me where I hope to be 5 years from now, which is not going to be a vegan. I know that. But it's hopefully going to be a diet that kind of recognizes a little better what the challenges we have in front of us, with the climate and, things that I could do, myself.
Let me ask you on a different spectrum. So there's two parts of individual action, I would say.
Right,
One part is the what you're talking about, those consumer choices you make.
right,
Another part is how often this is a dialogue point when you're talking to friends and family and colleagues. Whether you're talking to Steve the Groot or or Anna Marie.
and that's where I think some of the actions spark the conversation, right?
Mm-hmm.
If somebody says, "Geez, you didn't have the steak, why didn't you have the steak?" Well, I really enjoy this too, right? And quite honestly, there's a lot going on with that steak, right? And that may spark those kind of conversations, like what you said with my buddies, whether they're old college buddies like Steve or work associates and things like that. I'm probably not the person that's ever going to go to say, "Hey, I'm having a salad. This guy's having a burger," and going, "You know what? That burger you're eating, it's really messing up the climate," right? I'm never going to be that guy, right? But I do hope that through actions and changes I'm making, right? People will understand that, right? So if you are at my house and there's a cloth napkin versus paper napkins, right? I mean, some of that's I like that, but also I realize now that's better for the environment than using paper napkins and throwing them out every day.
If you think about your close friends, and I think of people like Steve, like Tommy, like Kevin, like Keith,
right?
Where today would you say, like, within that circle, are you, kind of more climate crisis oriented than your friends? And do you think now you bear some responsibility for bringing them along, as I've tried to bring, kind of you along to a degree on this topic? Or do you think they're like, you're like, you guys are in the same, kind of same shoes right now? Or how do you think about that?
But no, I think I can't speak for all of them because, they may have more, advanced views or different views than I think they have. But yeah, I would say I'm probably more advanced than my, the people I kind of associate with or hang out with, right, in general, when it comes to the climate change and the urgency level. And I'll say I feel maybe some responsibility, right? And it's something that, I'm very open to talking with them about a number of different topics. I've known most of them for, 40 years, right? And I think that it will happen. And I think because, when we generally get together, we talk about, what's going on with our kids, since we all have adult kids now. So, certainly when you come up, I talk about a lot of things you're doing, right, as well as what we've been doing, which is the climate change course and how it has had an impact, and that even in the recent past, in some of my discussions with different people, had us led to, what are you talking about? And hopefully I've gotten them to, I don't have the tools yet, and they're at my disposal, I know, but hopefully they've gone back, maybe Googled something that I might have said or that I referred to, right? But I think, I may want to get to that next level and say, hey, here's a web link, or here's a good site to go to if you want to get started, right? So,
yeah.
But yeah, no, this is, I mean, it is just the awareness, and I thank you for the kind of courage to say, hey, Dad, why don't we take this course together to see what it's about?
Yeah, it's been a journey. I think, you and I will continue to have these conversations as, and, it's something too, I'm always learning as well. There's, for the listeners, there's an episode coming up shortly around a kind of deeper dive on the wildfires and a lot of different perspectives. And in that episode, I talked to kind of a lifelong mechanic who does work for ranchers and agriculture professionals in Fresno, California, who kind of opened me up to some different thinking around what's kind of behind the increase in the fires. And we're always like, we always need to sort of continue to just gather information and learn and grow in that way, which is my biggest worry of, like, just a society that is, primarily gathering headlines and reacting to headlines and going to the next headline, not doing a lot of deeper information consumption that was more common in your generation. And so, yeah, I think the most important thing to do, as important, if not more important than those individual behavior changes, is just continue to have these conversations with those around you. So with that, we can kind of wrap it up. Appreciate you having the conversation here for all those listening. Let's just keep both of us keep progressing on this subject matter.
They're great dialogues, Jay, and I love having them, especially when we disagree on certain things. But I think it's important that, you kind of see where I come from, and I even say generationally, and it's very insightful for me to see, where you're at and, the journey you've been on. So I think, that helps me a lot with, kind of the zeal to learn more and want to learn more and to keep learning and making, some type of impact for the future generations.